Hello everyone! In this video, we're going to go over how you can create a funky bass line. Now, when it comes to doing something like this, there's many various aspects that we're going to need to cover. However, this is going to help you a lot more than just a simple step-by-step guide, because when you're done with this video, my goal is to help you have a foundation on which to build all of this information from. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and place in all of our root notes for now and sync them up with our bass drum. Alright, so let's actually preview the drum pattern that we're working with first, and then we'll go into our piano roll and start mapping things out. So as you can see, it's going to be a great foundation that we can work from and start our bass line. So I already have part of a piano roll set up here, and let's go ahead and actually start working on the bass line. So in this case, we'll just work from the key of G. It's one of my favorite to work in. And now let's start analyzing where the kick drum hits. Okay, so let's place all these notes on time with the kick drum. So we have the very foundation laid out for our bass line. And one thing we need to do before we go on to the next step is actually really look at the length of notes and maybe kind of understand how important that is. So let's actually investigate the concept of having these shorter notes. When it comes to creating any catchy melody, well, not any, but it's a very good way to think about it, is staccato notes are often associated with something being catchy, being fun, and being playful. And in this introduction to creating bass lines, we're going to use that concept to our advantage. And not only that, we're going to use it as we get further in to create percussiveness to the bass line. So let's take a preview of what it sounds like now. And in this example, we're actually going to use a blues scale to really help get our bass line in order. And the last thing is, you don't really have to stick to any particular scale to make a bass line funky. The most important part is the rhythm. So if you have a chord progression and you really want to follow the progression with your bass line, that's important too. Another thing to note is also thinking about chord tones if you're following any sort of progression that has prominent chords. This can be a very useful tool into highlighting chords and creating other tensions within the bass line. So as you can see here with the blues scale, we have that passing tone that I talked about, which is your C sharp, or you can also call it a D flat. And you can use these sort of tones to your advantage when creating your bass line to make it more funky and interesting. And we're going to do that here at this time as well. Now we have a couple different options we can do, and one of those options is start to add more notes. So we've defined the scale that we want to work in. The next thing we want to take into consideration is the rhythmic elements of the bass and also thinking of percussive elements. So now this is what we're going to focus on now, and once I start to do this, things are really going to come together. So let's actually start thinking about the subdivisions that we're going to be making use of when we're creating a bass line. In a lot of, I guess you could say, black music, it's mainly focused around those 16th note subdivisions, and that's kind of where all the juiciness lies. And if you've seen my drum tutorial, I mentioned that same thing, and it's something I'm going to harp on about for a long time if you want to make this style of music that's more funky, I guess. And we're going to use that to our advantage here as well. And more specifically, subdivisions that are going to be your friend are going to be this one here and this here. Because it's not offset on an eighth note and it's set even further back, it's actually tricking the brain and creating a lot more of a fun mood. Now there's again, more detail I can go in there, but that's another video as well. But just keep in mind that placing various notes within these subsections can be very crucial to actually creating a very funky sound. Now, you don't only want to put it in there. You can also just focus on very straight eighth notes as well. And it's important that you kind of create a contrast between both. Okay, so you can see things are really starting to come along now. We still have quite a ways to go, but let's analyze what's happening now. So we've actually used a note here on the 16th subdivision, an octave higher than the bass note itself. And if you watch funk bassists, they'll use that technique all the time, and we're going to utilize that same thing here. And by doing that, we're creating a sense of rhythm that's going to have interplay with the drums. The next thing, we're taking into consideration various degrees of the scale, and by doing that, it's allowing us to add some melodic elements to our bass line. Now you'll notice that I still have a lot of use of the root note. We can make many different changes as time goes along, but keep in mind, when we're locking it down, we're really trying to create a very good sense of, the root note of the bass line. You don't always have to do this, but this is a good way to start out. And you can, over time, start experimenting with moving that around more. But for now, we're going to not play with it too much. So you can see here, we're actually going to be using the B flat from the scale to create like a minor third interval. And we're also making use of the F from the scale a half step down. So what we're doing is creating little bits of tension that want to go back to the root note, and we're playing with that. And we're using it to, not a maximum effect, but we're really increasing that tension here, where we're using that passing tone that is included within the blues scale. And we're going from a D to a D flat all the way down to a C. And this is creating a resolving tension at the end of the bass line that wraps nicely back into the very beginning. Now here's a cool thing, you don't have to use these tones either. We could easily make a different change. So instead of using these tones, we could use an entirely different set of passing tones. So we're actually using a G flat or an F sharp, and that's just using as a tone to create tension to move into the next note of the scale. And it's technically not in key at all, but the fact that it's not actually within the scale itself is totally fine, because we're just using it as a tension note to get to the note we're going for. And this is that concept I talked about earlier of creating little miniature tensions within your instrumentation to create more unique interest. So for the sake of this, we'll go back to our initial idea that we had, but I just wanted to show you another possibility. And we might end up utilizing it more within the structure of the bass line. All right, so let's start adding more notes. It's important not to go too crazy, but we might make this bass line a little bit more dense just to show off some different concepts. So things are really starting to come along, aren't they? And that's because we're really taking these principles into account. Now we did that with using the B flat and also with using, I think it was F, but we're also taking use of that passing tone I talked about within the blues scale to create another sense of tension at the very end of the bar. However, we're doing another fun thing, and we're using something that's not even part of the scale, and we're using that F flat. Are we? Or what are we using? We're using our G flat. And by taking that G flat and working our way up to our G, it's another tension note. And even though it's technically not in key, it's perfectly okay because we're resolving it immediately. And that's going to be a very important part to think about if you start to explore with using notes out of key. And we focused even further. As you can see and hear, we're actually creating a cluster of notes at the end that uses a fair amount of grace notes and sliding. Now let's actually look in again and start talking about that some more. Now this is going to be a very effective method to really getting your bass lines to have character and to really feel unique within themselves. And what I'm actually doing is I'm using grace notes into the next note itself to create little microcosms of tension and release. And the cool thing is you don't even have to necessarily use tones and scale. Now in this case we're going to try to stick to our scale, but I highly encourage you to start thinking about maybe using things a semitone apart. Generally a semitone or a whole tone is a good safe bet, but you can even go further into like thirds or fourths, fifths, and use those sorts of maneuvers too. But for now this is playing it safe. And you'll also notice there's a flow to this section, right? So we're going from our D flat into our D, and instead of using another grace note down like this, which is perfectly fine, to kind of give it a feeling of movement in a direction, we're using our grace note above. And by combining those two elements, we're creating a very unique, well not unique, but we're creating an interesting passage. And you can kind of hear what it's actually doing is creating a nice juxtaposition to this very rooted bass line that actually makes it feel kind of slippery. And the reason it feels slippery in this case is we're also doing a legato up to the next note, but we are creating a grace note that's offsetting the note that we want to get to by a little bit. So that's also creating a feeling of tension and disjointedness. But because of the ways our ears perceive music and our expectations, it creates a very pleasant and enjoyable, playful sound. And this is something you'll really want to start looking into as you get more experienced and really starting to understand on a more fundamental level. And I think something like that you just really have to practice with different sorts of arrangements to get an idea of really how this works. Okay, so on to the very last step, and that's going to be making use of vibrato. And vibrato is very much a thing of taste. So what may sound really good to me may not sound as good to you. However, I really like to use heavy vibrato, and I also like to use it at a pretty fast rate. And that's just going to add more tension and more slipperiness. So let's go ahead and start painting in our vibrato. And once we're done with that, we'll go and do an overview of everything that we did, summarize it, and then conclude the video. When it comes to deciding where to use your vibrato, a good rule of thumb is to think about where you have notes that are extended out for a longer period of time, so that way you kind of create more context for the ear to understand what's going on. Because if you use it on something that's really short like this, it's actually just going to make it sound out of tune, because the vibrato is going to only move up a certain amount, and it's just going to sound like the note is not correct. So you may actually have a vibrato, and because of the way it's working, it may sound like you're a semitone up or a semitone down. So I'm actually going to further emphasize this really weird part of the bass and add in some vibrato, and it's going to be very... So the vibrato itself is actually going to be very short, and if you think about how a player is going to be playing it, you will kind of like tap the mod wheel up and let it fall back down naturally. So we're going to kind of emulate that feeling here. And let's see how it sounds. Sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? So let's actually add this to another part. We're going to just make a brief modification to this, and we're going to add a passing tone up to the D. let's face it, when it comes to making a funk bass line, there's a lot of things that you have to go over and understand, and it's going to be very hard to do it in only one video. But I hope at the very least I started to give you maybe a foundation to think about how to create these passages and how to create these bass lines. Okay, so this is enough talking for now. I hope that my video helped guide you in the direction of creativity and expression, and I also thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I know when it comes to learning new stuff like this, it can be very daunting, and I really hope that I was able to maybe clarify some stuff for you. And if you still have questions, feel free to ask them in the description below. I'll try to keep up and see if I can really help answer any loose ends that might exist within the video. Additionally, if you want to see more content like this, please subscribe to my channel. I'm going to be doing all sorts of interesting videos related to music theory, music production, and maybe some other stuff in between. But I'm just hoping maybe this more straightforward approach might help some of you who are kind of lost when it comes to maybe understanding music theory, because I know I was and I still feel lost all the time. Alright everyone, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and I guess good night.